Please welcome to the stage, Gary Kim.
I have to tell a joke. The last time I saw Richard Lucage, we were in a piano bar in New York City, and we pretended he was a famous movie actor who appears on the TV comedy Friends, and people were clapping for him, and hysterical. Today I'd like to introduce two people who are going to help us walk through things that may happen in the next 40 years and how we'll get there from where we are. Dean Bubley is my first guest. He's the founder of Disruptive Analysis and a globally well-known mobile analyst, and I actually think he would describe himself as a technology futurist more than that. So, Dean, why don't you come on up?
Thanks.
And also joining us on the stage is Connie Whiteman, who is the CEO and Chairman of Technologies Management, and as far as I know, one of the few people in the room who was in the business before the Bell breakup. So, Connie, please join us. Okay, so the really hard part about talking about where we're going in the future is that none of us as human beings are very good at predicting it, and I would dare say most of us who have tried to predict it have been wrong more than we've been right. I also recognize that most of us in the conduct of our daily business don't have to know much about the future, so we don't think about it all that seriously, but we'll try to think about it seriously this morning. I may just start out by asking both of you where we have been in the past, what you see as being different today, and then we'll launch into a discussion of how things may look from here out. So, Connie, why don't you?
Okay, sure, I'll start with that. When I started my company a long time ago, 30 years ago, my first computer was an AT&T green screen. I had a state-of-the-art printer that was daisy wheel and dot matrix. So I could do a draft tariff, and then I could do a final version very quickly. Took all day. So I've seen huge changes, and I've also been one of those many companies that couldn't have existed before the changes that we've seen unfold in the last 30 years. Could not have existed. And one thing after another has led to changes that we couldn't have envisioned. And I certainly wanted no part of. I didn't even want voicemail at one point in time. Now voicemail is irrelevant because everybody wants to text. And I can remember sitting with some folks at AT&T back when I worked with AT&T, and they were explaining how cellular networks were going to work. And I really didn't get the point. So I think what happens is, as it unfolds, we start to imagine how we can use that in a very practical sense, and that drives the next step, if you will.
So one of the things I should mention, Connie's business is built around helping people become lawful service providers. Yeah. When she started her career, it was against the law for anyone but her firm to be in this business. So that's a lot of change. Dean, from the UK perspective, and you're younger than us, so what do you see?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily sort of focus in on the UK specifically, but what I would think the big changes that I've seen over the 20, 25 years I've been watching this is it's got a lot harder to define things. There are a lot more blurred boundaries than in the past, where you could define a service provider or long distance or a device. And I think that the advent of software, of the internet, has a number of other technology changes has blurred those boundaries to the extent that from a regulatory point of view or a market definition point of view or a competitive point of view, it's very hard to classify things with nice bright lines. The other thing that I think that's changed is speed. And it's a bit of a cliche to talk about the rate of change, but I think that there are certain areas where we do see huge acceleration, particularly in moving from, say, one version of a product to the next, which now may be in days or weeks. If you look at the number of times Facebook updates its app, for example. And that has huge implications for things like regulatory, for planning, financial horizons. You look at the ITU, for example, with a 4-year cycle for World Radio Congresses, and people think, well, frankly, that's an order of magnitude longer than perhaps it ought to be for dealing with possible innovations. And how do we bridge that? Where's that zero coming from?
I'm going to give you both a provocative question, and then we can start chewing this around. I would argue that one of the changes I've seen is that telecom used to be the center of its own universe and its own ecosystem, could largely determine its own fate within some limits. Regulators always have something to say. I would now argue that telecom is a tail on an internet dog, that we are actually part of the internet ecosystem and actually do not determine our own fate. We've got all these new technologies coming that you study. To what degree can we say we still have some control over our future, and how much, and what's going to change?
I don't think that telecommunications is a separate sector anymore. I think the boundary between the application and the transmission is so blurred now. You've got General Motors and Google and Facebook, and they're not only huge customers of the communications companies, they're also competitors with the communications companies. And so as a result of that, as those, the application and the transmission become one thing, you have to adapt from a regulatory standpoint and from a business standpoint to a whole different way of doing business and thinking about where telecom fits in there.
I think that the key for me is the word service. We have grown up thinking of telecommunications as a service, which has subscribers, it has ongoing relationships that are service-type delivery models. And in fact, I think what we're realizing is that a service is just one way of delivering a capability. And a capability could be a network transport, it could be an application like a phone call, or it could be the internet as a platform. And so instead what we now have is capabilities, some of which are services that are perhaps delivered by both traditional and new forms of service provider. We also have democratization of the basic building blocks that mean that people can have their own network or their own voice system. And then as well, so you have service, you have ownership, and you have things like amenity as well. So the Wi-Fi in this room isn't a service, it's a function of the building. It's like an amenity like the air conditioning or the drinks in the break or the lavatories or something like that. It's part of the fabric of the building. And so I think that shift from service mentality to a broader capability is one that we need to get our heads around.
And one would expect that the application interfaces, the internet or whatever it is at some point in time, will be as ubiquitous as the electrical outlets.
Yeah, and perhaps not just the internet. I mean, a lot of one of the biggest category errors I see at the moment is IoT. In fact, a large proportion of things are going to be using networks other than the internet. As we, the sort of capital I public internet. Some will, some won't. And I think that if you're running moisture sensors in a field as a farmer, you may well stand up your own wireless network, and you might interconnect it with the internet, but locally it's your wireless network. It's like it could be electricity or anything else. Right.
And we also have, one of my clients yesterday was talking about how as carriers want to do more and more direct connect, in fact, not everybody can direct connect to everything. And in the Internet of Things, you're going to have a zillion things that have to interconnect. So there's still a role for the value-added party who does the decoding and who does the aggregation. And that's what I kind of envision the telecommunications industry is going to look like.
We were chatting earlier about AT&T's strategy, and I believe what you said was, I'm not quite sure I understand their strategy. Now, I have a stock answer for that, but
okay.
and you know what
Let
it
me
is.
hear it.
And it has to do with being the tail on the application dog. And it's not really the internet I'm concerned about. It's the applications that enterprises and human beings care about are the things that actually have value. And we are, for better or worse, coming out of a legacy of being the bit suppliers, the pipe suppliers. And I'm really concerned that that is not what drives value anymore. Facebook drives value. My connection, I don't know how much value is really there. I have multiple choices, lots of suppliers.
But the applications kind of ebb and flow. Facebook is popular today, but I can remember when it was a different social networking program. So,
and I think actually one of the things I really like is that you said application and not content. And I think that we have to start thinking about, yes, content is important, big slabs of movies or something like that. Applications, cloud, control and signaling, there's sort of microservices, which are sort of components of applications. And I think that one of the things we have to think about is that there's not just one silo that we can put all the sort of things which consume network capacity into, and that's a dynamic situation on its own, and there's new classes of demand.
Right.
So actually, to get back to my AT&T strategy thing, 20 years ago, and for those of you who don't know that I do this, my business consulting practice is built on one single idea. I mean, most consulting firms have methodologies that they use, and mine is also built on a methodology. I've actually believed for 20 years that the price of all telecom services is going to trend nearly to zero. And I think that there's no question that's where it goes over a period of time, that this is the kind of trend we see. So I personally, and I hope I'm wrong about this, really believe that if we don't stop being just Bitpipes, it's not going to be a very attractive business for anyone to be in, because I don't see any evidence that that's not going to happen.
You're still going to have a Bitpipe. You're still going to have a way to exchange all that data. And we were talking before about what is that, how can you envision that technology?
Oh no, I'm not saying that the Bitpipe will still be there, but it's like, look at Wi-Fi. I spend 10 times as much time interacting with my bits and my applications using Wi-Fi than I do on my mobile network. Now, I still pay the fee, but I'm not using it. And so I agree with you, the access has to be there, but whether you get paid for it is the sort of the question.
But your Wi-Fi standalone is of little use. You have to get the data in, you have to get the application connected. So it has that edge.
Actually, historically, Wi-Fi was designed for local area networks. It's wireless LAN. But I'll actually take issue, and I think that part of the problem is this word pipe. Packets aren't fluids, networks aren't pipes, and we've had this sort of flawed analogy drilled into our consciousness over the last sort of decade or two. And I think that it's made us sort of think, well, two things. Firstly, some pipelines are really profitable, if you look at the oil industry, for example. And the other thing is they're not dumb. There's an awful lot of complexity that goes into managing them. So we've firstly got an error in terms of a flawed analogy, but also we characterize it, this bit pipe, dumb pipe, it induces in us negativity to something which is important and foundational. And you see the same with pejorative terms like OTT, which I really push back against. There's some certain things like pipe, OTT, and worst of all, digital, which I want to have banished from the industry, because all of them are hugely damaging and dangerous, because words are important and analogies are important.
But you have to, your question really is what adds value that can be monetized, it's a business. And I think that that's the question really that everybody's going to be facing, and everybody that's attending these conferences faces that question.
I think the thing we'll find is that there are, our concept of a network will get atomized into either layers or perhaps verticals. And so you'll have layers around identity, particularly around security, around sort of management and visibility, API access, so sort of programmability. And so if you like, it's all of those sort of adjectives and adverbs rather than the noun that we should be looking to monetize. And I think that's something that gets overlooked. The other side is we will find customized networks for particular industries, for particular use cases. The network you use inside a factory is very different to the one you will use to connect vehicles in a forest or suboceanic. And I think we will have platforms to allow us to create custom versions of networks. And then it's a question of who the service providers or network owners that underpin and monetize that. And whether they directly monetize it or they use that capability as an ingredient of something larger. So if you look at like an Amazon or a Facebook, their network is there to power other stuff. It's an ingredient, a piece part, along with electricity or the metal enclosure on their servers or whatever it happens to be.
And when you think about what consumers are going to want and need, then obviously as things get more and more connected around them, they're going to care more and more about privacy and net neutrality or whatever the concept is, and security.
Yeah.
And so those and the network providers today, the communication providers, whether they're cable companies or telephony companies, are going to have to figure that out.
Well, both figure it out and also do some R&D. One of the things which I find is shocking is how little most telecom service providers do actually properly innovate, and how much they push out to their vendors or industry groups. If you look at other large companies in the pharmaceutical industry or automotive or a whole range of other things, or especially network technology and the Facebooks of this world, they do many billions of dollars of proper innovation and science and engineering. Most carriers, even the very largest, with the exception maybe of a couple in Japan and one or two elsewhere in the world, don't even go above $1 billion. The aggregate, I think, of all telcos in the world is probably about the same as Huawei or Samsung's R&D.
Really?
Maybe less, even.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's partly problems with managing it and the organizational friction of when I do speak to the labs of even tier one operators, they often complain that they come up with really interesting proofs of concept, which the difficulty they get is having them adopted by the lines of business. And there's a bit of a disconnect between the labs groups and the business units.
Is the development effort mainly focused on the application side?
It's a real mix, and I think that to be honest, one of the things that needs to happen is people to get a bit more down into the weeds. People talk about Facebook and Amazon and Google as web companies, whereas in fact, they design chips, they build submarine fibers, they build data centers, they build their own servers. They hire scientists who do research into quantum technology and AI.
Are you not counting their R&D in the telecommunications?
I think that they have a much broader view of advanced technologies. And it comes back to what Gary was saying. They don't think of telecommunications necessarily as a silo. It's one of a broad set of technologies which they're investing in. Some operators go part of the way to that. So there are some that do have interesting research on. I met one of the Korean operators that's developed its own quantum key cryptography solution, pretty much from scratch. You have some that are developing, perhaps in conjunction with academia, AI tools and techniques. And you have some, Telstra, I know, has an investment into a 5G wireless chip innovator. But those are few and far between. Actually, perhaps the most startling one is SoftBank, which acquired companies like Arm. It's got its huge vision fund where it gets co-investors in a plethora of technology companies. But those are the exceptions rather than the rule.
Well, in strong, very strong defense of carriers, because I believe we don't innovate well, absolutely agree. But I think there are real important reasons for why that is the case. I mean, built into your strengths as a human being normally are also your weaknesses. That's just the flip side. And the issue with the carrier is so much of what you do is just engineering and operations and that kind of stuff. And you just don't have your organization geared for innovating in terms of applications. And that's really the important thing, not how we run our networks. It's what do people want to buy from us, and can we create those things? And this is also structural, right? Because Facebook is as a customer knows exactly what it wants from all the other lower layers. I'm the customer. I know what I want to buy, and if I can build it myself, I'll build it. We have to go out and do all this market research to figure out what does this customer want in this vertical, that customer want in the other vertical. That's very difficult. It's very hard. It's tedious and expensive.
And then they go and spend $5 billion on a content acquisition that no one uses. Yeah, or something like that. That is not an unusual.
They have to go down some rabbit holes.
Yeah, and we make mistakes, by the way.
Everyone does.
But I wouldn't argue that because we make mistakes, we don't have to keep making more mistakes until we get it right. I just think it's survival. We're going to fail a lot, but failure is what leads to success if you iterate enough.
That's true.
I suppose we can also point a finger at regulators and sort of how much time and management, attention and bandwidth, no pun intended, goes on dealing with laws and rules versus spending that same management attention on creating new stuff.
Emergency services. Everybody in ops that you will ever talk to in your life will say, we spend 90% of our effort on something that costs us money. We have no time to worry about the 10% of things that could make us money, and that's how important it is. But that's the sort of thing that sort of, you're Hercules and you're chained.
Well, there's a couple of things here that play together. One is, as you said, if you really believe that the cost of voice minutes or voice bandwidth is approaching zero, then that also doesn't leave a lot of room for investing in R&D because they get squeezed margins on that side of it.
But that's been predictable for 20 years. Yeah, we've known. Skype started appearing, was it 1997 or maybe before that? Yeah, it's not exactly...
from the outside in, though. They didn't come from AT&T.
True. But all of this, I mean, things that everyone talking about, say, messaging. So SMS probably generated $1 trillion of profits for something which frankly didn't deserve it. And it was obvious for at least 10 to 15 years that would come to an end sooner or later. Now, it turned out that it tended to be around about 2009, 2010, because the phones you could get in 2004, 2005 from Symbian, Nokia, were a bit clunky to install apps on. You couldn't get the virality. So there's like a 5-year gap. And I mean, you look at some of the things that the industry does, and there's 10 years, and we're still talking about this messaging service called RCS, which is literally 10 years old, which is a bugbear of mine, and it was obsolete 10 years ago, and it's not getting any fresher.
Yeah. From a regulatory standpoint, you don't want the regulators deciding what the future is going to look like. They need to react to what the reality is today and build in whatever protections the public needs. But you don't want them making those choices.
No. And often they're sort of picking winners and losers.
Absolutely.
Often goes spectacularly wrong. I'm wondering if we're going to see that with 5G at the moment, because it seems to be in policy circles, there's this sort of people holding up 5G as almost like this sort of halo technology, which is going to be like magic dust. We just sprinkle 5G-ness on everything, and therefore everyone makes money, and it's not going to be like that. And I think that's coming partly from government circles that I speak to. People sort of seem to have slapped 5G label on it because it's easier to spell than digital.
Well, that's because they're faced with how are we going to get the bandwidth to the end user?
Yes and no. I mean, but they've also bought into a lot of the rhetoric that it's going to be this amazing, exponential, immediate step change 2020, and we'll switch the lights on in, telemedicine robots or something, or self-driving cars and 5G is a classic one where when I speak to the car manufacturers, and I've spoken to them at an AI conference, and I said, well, I work with the telecoms industry, what do you want from a future network and a future network provider? And I paraphrased, but the answer I got back was, we want as little as possible and we're not going to pay for it anyway. We are going to make vehicles that they can use connectivity, but they're going to, our lawyers tell us they have to work offline. We're not going to be doing cloud breaking. Frankly, I wouldn't get a vehicle that was doing that. And if you're driving through a forest and an animal jumps in front of you, you want to react in a microsecond, not a millisecond or 10 milliseconds. I want the moose recognition algorithm in the vehicle on an image recognition.
No delays.
Actually, I hadn't thought about it, but in terms of next generation 911 emergency calling, my vision now, and we didn't do it, Amazon did it, is Alexa, call 911. And some version of that where we've got sensors, voice activation all around you all the time. And you literally just, it's not, you send a text message or whatever, simply say, Alexa, call 911. And people know where you are.
We're in the middle of a big 911 conversion project. And it's still an intense amount of interconnectivity between all the network operators.
In Europe, there's a law called ECOL, which demands that vehicles starting from this May, if they're a new model of vehicle which gets certified, have to have this capability that in an accident they automatically call the emergency services. And they send information about the direction and the speed and the type of vehicle and location and so on. And the problems there of just getting the thing working, and does the vehicle have to have its own phone number so the emergency service can call it back? If I'm British and I buy a German-made car and I drive it in Sweden, which emergency call centre does the call go to, and can they speak the right language? And then if they have to call me back, who calls me back from where? And what happens if that PSAP can't make international calls? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and the PSAPs are not going to be just receiving calls. They're going to be receiving text. They're going to be receiving videos. And so there's many iterations left to do on that. And GM and other automobile manufacturers are surely doing a lot of R&D in that area.
I think there may need to be something almost like an emergency API, which allows pretty much any communication tool or application to have an emergency interface, because there's a lot of people who either don't or can't or won't make phone calls. And also, you can imagine situations where you don't want to be verbal because you want to, so you either send a text message or a WhatsApp, or it could be using Amazon, or it could well be that you've got ambient sensors, as you say. Now, then you have a problem with false alarms, and that's where you perhaps then you have an interesting question of, if you try and think, we'll filter them with AI.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's an AI application.
But then you have the issue of false positives and false negatives. Mm-hmm. Yeah, how many things which should get through don't, and how many things which that shouldn't get through do, and that's going to exercise people for a long time.
Yeah, and no offense to my unified communications community friends, but why is it that I believe you're going to have Alexa be your business home phone? It's already my speakerphone, right? It's the kind of thing where you can say, here's this little toy thing. We couldn't figure out what to do with that box, to be quite honest, when we first got it. But why, in fact, could you not say, got an incoming call, send it to Ted?
Yeah.
Boom.
Well, once upon a time, we didn't know what to do with a microwave either. I mean, the world has changed radically, and having the tool in your hand, you have a lot of designers, because everybody who is using that tool becomes a designer
exactly.
and how it can be used.
And I think design is a really critical part, as well as CTO. It's actually an interesting thing is Apple doesn't have a CTO, it does have a CDO, Chief Design Officer. And actually, one thing, if you were going to design voice communications today, rather than 140 years ago, you wouldn't design it as a phone call. I think the phone call has been pretty good for a century, but it's a bit obsolete now. But anyway, that's a topic for another discussion.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the future's coming, and we're still going to be wondering, but we're out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.